Okay, when I was having breakfast this morning and pondering how to introduce Jonathan, I heard the news that famous Seamus Heaney is dead. And I'm a fan, and I looked at some of his poetry. And there are two types of poems that he does that I really like. One is about digging. You may not have read many poems about digging, but there are poems about digging, and the other are poems about craftsmanship. And it seemed to me that that is a pretty good description of Jonathan's contribution to linguistics. So the digging, obviously, is the patient toil of going beyond the surface and finding the generalizations and the structures. And the craftsmanship, well, that's the analysis, and you can see that they're usually built very solidly and beautifully, and are a pleasure to behold. I use Jonathan's papers in my teaching. I always try to put at least one in as an example of how linguistics should be done, in addition to the other papers that you have to read because they happen to be fashionable. So I'm personally extremely happy that he's here. In the early 90s, when I was a PhD student, I spent some time in, at MIT, and I remember quite vividly the moment that I got to know Jonathan, or at least from a distance. I was walking down the street with a friend. We were off to buy a bottle of red wine and chocolate cake. And there was this guy on the other side of the street, looking, you know, well, he had long hair and all that. And she greeted him, and then she pointed him out to me and said, "You know who that is? That's Jonathan Bobaljik. He'll be a star. And he's very, very nice." Jonathan Bobaljik, you're a star, and you're very, very nice.
Thank you very much for that. That's beyond embarrassing. But and thank you all for having me, and the Society in particular. I'm very glad to be here. What I want to talk about today will sort of recapitulate some earlier work, because I want to tell you what I've done further, but you wouldn't really understand what I've done further unless I sort of tell you where it's coming from. So I'll try to bring everybody up to speed. What I want to talk about, surprise, surprise, is suppletion. And of course, well, what suppletion is, here's examples. You get long, longer, longest, but good, better, best, not good, 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 or goodest, right? And today's claim is going to extend an earlier claim that suppletion, far from being this sort of weird thing that's off in the corners of grammar, is actually something that's quite informative, that there are patterns in suppletion that are structure detectors that tell us about the internal structure of words. Endpoint of one of the hypotheses that I'll give away is what I call the containment hypothesis, and this is the hypothesis that the superlative is always built on top of the comparative. It always properly contains the comparative. The evidence for this, of course, is going to come from suppletion. The claim then is that what's disallowed is a simple superlative that attaches to adjectives. You read your textbook, English has a suffix ESC that's a superlative that attaches to adjectives, no such beast. These are always, they have the hidden structure in B. So that's going to be the argument that we're getting to. And that's the argument that's in the book, and so I'll review it relatively quickly because you can go and look it up if you haven't already. Quickly, suppletion occurs all over the place. We have it in the comparatives, examples of tense, walk, walked, go, went, plural nouns, etc. There are all kinds of places where suppletion happens. I'll point out right away, this has been observed by a few people before, the good, better case is the normal case where you retain the regular morphology and you just change the root, or the stem if you believe in stems. So it's just the root or the stem that changes, and the morphology is normally retained. Obviously not always. There's cases like bad worse, that's the worst case. What I'm focusing on today is suppletion not at the word level, but suppletion of the root, so change in the root. Okay? And the idea of suppletion goes back to Osthoff. in an early set of articles. In fact, his first case was the comparative. That was the paradigm case of suppletion, was the comparative paradigm in languages like English and German. What he suggests, so I mean, there's a question here about suppletion. What's the alternative analysis? And the alternative analysis, the one pre-Oswald, is the idea that there is an adjective good that doesn't compare, and there is an adjective better that means something very similar but doesn't have a positive form. So that's what's there in the background, is just this sort of confluence of semantically related forms. No, what I'm pursuing here is the idea that there really is suppletion, and what that means in sort of modern rule format is that there is an abstract lexeme, good, right, written in all caps, of course, to make it seem theoretically abstract, and that then has two realizations. There are two exponents for that. There is a form bet that occurs in the comparative and the superlative, and a form good that is the default. So these compete. I've formalized these as rules of exponents. If they're formalized as rules, then we know something about rule interaction, namely, quite generally, something like the elsewhere condition applies. That means the more specific rule takes precedence over the less specific rule whenever its environment is met. So you prefer to use the more specific rule. Okay? So what does that mean? Well, for the case at hand, let's look a little bit. If we we just heard about check in the morphology section, so we'll continue with check. Check has positive, comparative, and superlative grades of adjectives. Here's mladi, mladshi, nemladshi. And you see right away, as in all well-behaved Slavic languages, so not Russian, the superlative is built by adding a prefix to the comparative. You see the relationship transparently here, right? Okay, Czech, being a well-behaved language, also has suppletion. So the positive for bad is not positive, but the unmarked grade of bad is špatný, but in the comparative you get this root hor. Yeah? So there's a total change, it's a suppletive form, and so you get, we can write it as we've written the rules before, as rules of exponents. There is a comparative allomorph of the root. Okay, well, what happens in the superlative? We know that the superlative is formed in a way that properly contains the comparative. With no other rules, we of course use the comparative allomorph in the superlative. Why? This is the most specific rule consistent with this context because the superlative contains the comparative. So the comparative allomorph is chosen. What that means is we see quite typically the comparative suppletive forms extending to cover the superlatives as well. So here is Czech, špatný, horší, nehorší, and we see a whole list of these things in a quite variety of language, and we'll come back to this again at this point. And again, as I said before, in almost all cases, you see the relevant comparative and superlative morphology still sticking there. These are changes just in the root. You just change the root. Okay. This pattern I'll call the ABB pattern. There's a root A, the A root, so a regular adjective would be, so long, longer, longest would be AAA. This is ABB because the same root occurs in both of these. Not the same form, right? The comparative and the superlative are not the same, but they share a root that's distinct from the positive root. That's not the only pattern that exists. There's another pattern, the ABC pattern. It's rare, but attested. And for example, Latin bonus, melior, optimus, you have three distinct roots. So that's an ABC pattern. So that's, in a sense, doubly suppletive. You get suppletion on top of suppletion, which is presumably, given that suppletion is rare, suppletion on top of suppletion should be even rarer than it is. But it turns out that, by and large, that exhausts the possibilities. So I spent years going through grammars, and this is with a couple of apparent prima facie counterexamples that I have something to say about, but won't. This exhausts the pattern. You get the AAA pattern, the ABB pattern, the ABC pattern, but not good, better, goodest, no ABA pattern, and no AAB pattern, no good, good, or best pattern. For the ABA, which is what we'll talk about first, there's a few apparent counterexamples. For the AAB, there's really none except maybe one. The except maybe one has to do with Georgian. Subsequent to the book, the characterization of Georgian in Hewitt's work makes it a very nice set of cases for ABB patterns and containment. But subsequently, some Georgian speakers have challenged that data and presented it as an AAB pattern. And so I'm looking into that. Right? Quick word of caution here. By superlative, what I mean is terminology problems, right? We're linguists. No two of us use the same term the same way. So from now on, when I say superlative, I mean the relative superlative. That is the one that means more than all others. If you're the tallest, you're taller than all others. So what I don't mean is what are sometimes called absolute superlatives. These are, for example, the Italian issima type superlatives, the bellissima type. Yeah? Or Slovene has this bže prefix, yeah? Which means either to an extremely high degree or too much, excessive, or something like that. These are sometimes called superlatives, and I will not argue that these contain the comparative, and in fact they don't. So we'll put those aside. Okay. As I said, I have this hypothesis that I'm trying to defend, that the superlative contains the comparative, and of course I don't care about linear order, so check out the superlative on this side. I'm just interested here in the structure. Yeah? So the superlative properly contains the comparative, even in languages like English, where you don't see it. So the reason we have good, better, best in English, the ABB pattern, is exactly the same reason that we have špatně hoši, ne hoši, and not ne špatně ši, or whatever it would be in Czech, right? And that's because this is the most specific rule that fits in the context of the superlative. It fits in the comparative context, but it also fits in the superlative context because the superlative contains the comparative. And yes, of course, the ES and the EST historically is the ER of the comparative in English, in Indo-European. But when I'm arguing now that the superlative properly contains the comparative, I'm not arguing for a synchronic decomposition of the EST into ER plus T. What's the level of abstraction we're willing to go? That exceeds beyond what I'm willing to go. For me, all that's necessary is that at some level of sufficient abstraction, the superlative properly contains the comparative in English. And of course, you can see how to do Latin. This is clunky with this double marking over here, this definition of the context, and I'll come back to that in about 20 minutes or so. And so you can do ABB and ABC. We have all the tools we need, or almost all the tools we need, to exclude the ABA pattern. So the good, better, goodest pattern doesn't exist. Why not? Well, actually, before I say that, do I want to say that now? Let me come back just a second. Right, we know why good, better, goodest doesn't exist. Yeah? Why doesn't good, better, goodest exist? Because the superlative context will either be something that is more specific than the comparative context, so you'll take a more specific rule and you can get bonus, mellior, optimus, or the comparative will necessarily spread to the superlative because of this containment relation. Right? So you just can't describe good, better, goodest. Again, with a caveat we come back to. So there can't be an ABA pattern. Contrast that with a standard textbook style story that has adjective superlative, that has a real superlative affix. If you had that, then the comparative rule, the one you need for the comparative, there's no prediction at all that it will extend to the superlative. You would have to write a separate rule that has a homophonous form that goes into the superlative. So you should get ABA type patterns all over the place. There's absolutely no prediction that the B pattern should extend. Okay. So first piece of background, sort of independent evidence for this. In fact, the comparative, the superlative, the containment of the superlative of the comparative. No, that's not going to work. The containment of the comparative inside the superlative. The fact that the superlative contains the comparative is something we see transparently in a number of languages, from a number of families, so including Indo-European, but also in Chukchi, Cherokee, Ubud, etc. So this is fairly widespread, despite the fact that, of course, comparative morphology beyond Indo-European and its closest neighbors, Finno-Ugric, Basque, of course, Kartvelian, etc., comparative and superlative morphology is quite rare outside that domain. But when it does exist, we do find a lot of cases of transparent containment. Okay? So we have all the pieces we need. We get this result that you have ABB patterns, ABC patterns, no ABA patterns, and I haven't told you why we don't have AAB patterns. That comes later and turns out to be a little bit more complex. One last piece. So why don't we say longerist in English? Why aren't we, as English speakers, speaking Czech if this is really what happens? Well, okay, the magic of brute force rules. The comparative is unrealized in the context of the superlative. perfectly reasonable rule. And as we were talking to somebody at lunch or a coffee break, this could be a zero allomorph of the comparative, or it could be deletion of the comparative. I'm purposely using an ambiguous notation here to allow you to either choose your favorite one or choose the other one and then attack me on it. But, up to you. Okay, caveat, of course. Right? Of course, it's actually possible within this framework to describe an ABA pattern. This connects to something in the afternoon talks. Even with the containment relation, you could write a Latin prime where you have good goes to bone in the environment of the superlative, mel in the comparative, and bone in the positive, and you get bonus melior bonimus or bonissimus, depending on the is part, right? And that looks like an ABA pattern. Of course, that's possible. What this is it's not really an ABA pattern. It's an ABC pattern with accidental homophony of two allomorphs of the same thing. Right? These are separately listed rules of exponents. They're separately listed vocabulary items, if that's your vocabulary of choice. So it is possible by using accidental homophony to describe this unattested system. So, I mean, I could say, well, that's just exceedingly rare and we don't see it. I will throw out there a more stronger position. I will try to exclude that, and I'll suggest, though, that it's not excluded by any grammatical principle, but rather by an appeal to the general homophony avoidance as an acquisition strategy. So, again, we know various versions have been proposed of saying that learners avoid positing accidental homophony to the extent they can, and I'll say there's a special case of that learners avoid positing a contextual allomorph of a morpheme mu that is homophonous with the default exponent of mu. Okay, mouthful, which is a good time for water. Another way of saying this, which I won't adopt, but just in case you want it, if you don't like the all caps lexemes, and you believe that the default phonological form, the default lexeme is the stored underlying mental representation of a lexical item, then these would be rewrite rules, right? It would be a rule that rewrites bone as mel in the environment of the comparative. And so what this would say is that learners avoid positing a rule that rewrites x as itself in some context with no change, right? So there are no rules of allomorphy that just rewrite x as x, and that's the claim. Okay, empirical basis. Fundamentally, I'm not going to give you any statistics. I have trouble with statistics. But that's ambiguous, and I mean it in both senses. But this is fundamentally a statistical claim, right? This is a claim about gaps, okay? That certain patterns don't exist. But these are gaps in suppletion. Right? So in English, we have no ABC pattern. We have no good, better, optimal. Well, if you're an optimality theorist, maybe. But we don't have that as a sort of regular paradigm, right? So we have no ABC patterns. So here's a gap, right? What does this tell the child? The fact that suppletion is so rare, such a small piece of every language, the fact that there are gaps in suppletive patterns for any one language is uninformative. Nevertheless, I contend that this gap becomes informative and systematic and therefore in need of an explanation when it turns out to be a universal gap. So I looked at 300 and some odd languages. There's a combination of two samples here. So I looked at 100 and some odd, a nice broad technological sample, genetic aerial controls. But the problem with continuing in that vein, as I hinted at earlier, is that comparative and superlative morphology and suppletion in adjectives are themselves quite rare cross-linguistically, and in particular they're largely aerially concentrated here. So Greater Europe and the other languages I mentioned earlier. So then I switched to a mode of using the first sample to identify cases of comparative suppletion, and then I looked at a focused sample where we looked at all of the languages I could find that had suppletion, and then of course all of the immediately adjacent, either geographic or genetically adjacent languages, and outwards until I hit a point of no return. So after I looked at 15 Nach Dagestanian languages and found no suppletion in any of them, I gave up on Nach Dagestanian. Rev might tell me I'm wrong. But I didn't find any there. So I stopped in that family. Right? But in the sample that gives you the 300, I did place a limit. There aren't 15 Nach Dagestanian languages in it. I think there's 3. So in any event, we get about 70 languages that have comparative suppletion, but at this point, counting languages becomes an extremely dangerous game because, of course, the languages are related to one another. So to get over this, what I propose, and this is a methodology that will then apply later in the talk, haven't quite yet, but we'll get there, is to, instead of counting examples, we count cognate triples. So the good, bet triple, English, German, gut, besser, best, all of the Germanic languages, or almost all of them, have this same triple, and it's clearly cognate. So obviously, this represents one change somewhere in the steps of wherever, in dark history, that's then simply been faithfully preserved by all the daughter languages. So this is one data point in the data set. So when I say I have 116 cognate triples, I have 116 of these, right? This is just one. Now this one's cool because it's really widespread. Some of them are really small, so the Slavs can't agree on what the comparative of good should be. Each Slavic language has a slightly different one, so there you get many triples out of something. Even though the root is shared, you get many triples because we're counting distinct triples. Okay? So the advantage to this is that essentially what we're doing is we're using a proxy for instances of language change. What we're really, if I'm claiming that the containment hypothesis is really about UG, what I'm saying is that it constrains language acquisition. Of course, a child could learn any of these patterns. There are certain patterns that don't arise through instances of change. So what I really want to count is every time there's an instance of change in these patterns, what arose. And what arose is 111 ABB patterns and 5 ABC patterns, right? And basically no of the others. Yeah? Counting cognates is a proxy for counting change events. And it's a conservative proxy because when a suppletive pattern becomes regular, ABB to AAA, I don't count it at all. It isn't in there at all. So there's all kinds of changes that aren't counted in this. So it's conservative, and there are the raw numbers for you, if you will. Right? So of 116 examples, we have lots and lots and lots of the ABB, a handful of ABC, and then the ones in parentheses are apparent instances of the ABA pattern, which on closer inspection aren't substantiated. So, yeah, I won't point to those. Okay, so summary, we have no ABA pattern on very simple assumptions. We get no good, better, goodest pattern if we assume that the transparent containment that we see in many languages is actually abstractly there in all languages. And it is in fact impossible to attach a superlative directly to an adjective root. Right? It falls out fairly straightforwardly for the reasons I gave, why there should be this gap. Okay, so is this syntax or morphology? What kind of morphology is this? I've been giving you these structures. Well, really something that hangs behind this is the question, why should the containment hypothesis hold? And at the end of the talk, I'll suggest that it's got a semantic basis, that it's really about semantics. And if it's about semantics, then it shouldn't be limited to morphology, it should occur in syntax as well. So in fact, we see in periphrastic analytic comparatives, we see this containment relation in a number of places. So in French, you have co, plus co, and the superlative properly contains the comparative. When I first started working on this, I said, I've got this hypothesis that the superlative is always derived from the comparative. And an Italian colleague of mine stood up and said, of course, we learned that in school. So it's out there, and it's a regular pattern that you see in the syntax. So I will assume that the morphology is derived from the syntax in some way. So you have a syntax with a superlative phrase, it contains a comparative phrase, it contains an adjective phrase, and the morphology is derived by kind of combining these things. So you have periphrastic constructions that are in the syntax, and morphological constructions that are derived from it. That hypothesis actually gives us a couple of things already. So let's back up for a second. If we take off the superlative phrase, and we say that the way you make longer is by somehow combining the comparative and the adjective, whatever your favorite theory of that is, you take head movement, say, you put these two together, and you get this, you get the comparative, right? Longer? Okay, well, on the plausible assumption that you can't put all three heads together unless you can put the lower two together, right? You can't put superlative, comparative, and adjective all together unless you can independently put the comparative and the adjective together. Then you predict immediately what I call the synthetic superlative generalization, namely no language has morphological superlatives, long S, but lacks morphological comparatives, right? Why? Because if you can't make a morphological superlative unless you can make a morphological comparative, then you can't make a morphological superlative unless you can make a morphological comparative. That was a brilliant explanation of it, right? But I think you got it. You have to be able to make the small one in order to make the big one, even in languages like English, where it's not transparent, where we originally believed there was a superlative affix. If you believe it's possible to have a superlative affix, then this pattern, long, more, long, longest, should exist, and it doesn't. Okay, another generalization, and this launches us into some new stuff. So another generalization is the root suppletion generalization. Again, this is true, and here's where we've got to be careful to remember that I'm talking about root suppletion where the comparative and superlative morphology is preserved. Okay? So you get these patterns where you get A, B, B, is. This is the good, better, best that we've been talking about. Right? But you never find root suppletion that obligatorily preserves an adverbial comparative marker. So in languages where you get A, more, most A, A, more, most A, you don't get A, more B, most B. Care needs to be taken about things like Italian, but in general this is true. And in fact you see this internal to a single language. So Greek and with some qualification Italian and various others have an alternation between periphrastic and analytic, so periphrastic and morphological superlatives, but they adhere to this pattern. Right? So Greek has kakos, meaning bad, modern Greek, and it has a morphological comparative that's superlative, and it has a periphrastic comparative in free variation, but that, or nearly free variation, but that periphrastic comparative is not suppletive. Did I say superlative here? You know, I've been doing this for years and I still get those two mixed up. So let's back up a second. Greek has an adjective meaning bad, and it has a morphological comparative that is suppletive, yeah? And it has a periphrastic comparative that is not suppletive. Right? Why not? Okay, well here's a locality condition I can propose that says that one morpheme may not condition another, so it can't serve as the context in one of these rules of exponents if a phrasal boundary intervenes. Yeah? Fairly straightforward. We look at our trees, we don't worry about the superlative anymore. If you're in the, so here's the Greek lexicon, all of it. There are two allomorphs of bad, chairo and kak. Chairo occurs only in the comparative, and there's two allomorphs of the comparative, an affixal one and a freestanding one. Yeah? So if we choose to use a periphrastic superlative, then the comparative is not local to the adjective, a phrasal boundary intervenes, so you can't see the comparative, you must use the default form, and of course because the comparative is not an affix, you get this, so you get piokakos. But if you choose to put these two together, you have a morphological unit, therefore this is the most appropriate rule, the most specific rule consistent with the context. Likewise this one, and so you get suppletion restricted to the morphological unit. Yeah? Okay. Italian similar, but so let's step back for a second and ask about this, as I have been asked. Wait a minute, you're a distributed morphologist. In the theoretical framework you're working in, you've been claiming that these trees are fundamentally syntactic in nature, as opposed to having a much looser correspondence. Okay. Well, what I just presented to you sounded suspiciously like saying there's things that happen in the morphology and don't happen in the syntax. Right? So I'm sneaking in a sort of fundamental divide between morphology and syntax. It turns out the person who presented this to me as sort of a consequence of my theory also presented me with a counterexample. That's Heidi Harley. But when we sat down and looked at it, we realized, no, in fact, it seems this theory, when understood in syntactic terms, not as a distinction between syntax and morphology, but really understanding this notion of a phrasal boundary, makes the right predictions. So here's where we go with this. we go to Yaqui, language spoken in Arizona that Heidi's worked on. Yaqui has number governed suppletion, and this is participant number governed suppletion. So it's not, there's different kinds of verbal number, as we all know, and this is the one where it's a particular participant that governs suppletive forms of the verb. So the verb run has two forms, a singular and plural, wander. Kill has a singular and a plural form. For kill, they are determined by the object. Okay? So there's examples, he, she, it is walking, they are walking. The verbs are totally different and unrelated. Why? Because they're suppletive. Okay, this is syntactic suppletion. Why am I not in trouble? Okay? You've got some argument up here controlling suppletion on the verb. If I say that it has to be really, really close together, why am I not in trouble with this? And the reason we're not in trouble with this is when you look more closely, at least we think, when you look more closely at the spectrum of participant number governed suppletion instances of, repose that phrase, what you find is this. So let's go back and look at kill for a moment. In kill, right, it's the object but not the subject that triggers suppletion. Is the object separated from the verb by a phrasal boundary? Well, in Syntax 101, it isn't, right? It's within the same phrase, right? So the object is sufficiently local, given the locality condition that I posited for comparatives, and assuming, crucially, that this is not morphology versus syntax, that this is really syntactic locality, that it's about phrases, right? So we predict, in fact, that as long as you can maintain that it's always the object position, or for intransitives, only patientive intransitives, i.e. unaccusatives, that trigger participant number governed suppletion, then we are consistent with the general hypothesis. And in fact, if we go back to the people that have looked at participant number governed suppletion, so Dury was the first survey, Grev has worked on this, Veselinova spoke. If you look at all of the observed cases of stem suppletion for number, it's the number of the principally affected argument, which is always an object or an intransitive subject, and never a transitive subject that governs suppletion of the verb. And we then need an additional test to actually go and look at each of these languages and look at the intransitive subjects and ask, are these the unaccusatives? And of course, the off-the-cuff look says, yes, all of the verbs that do this are ones that do behave as unaccusatives in some languages. That's good. It's obviously not entirely sufficient because we know there's a lot of variety in unaccusativity from language to language, so we need to go a little bit further and look language by language for unaccusativity diagnostics to support this. And we have done this for all of one language, namely Yaqui. But it turns out that, so dance, right, which seems sufficient, dance is agentive, it is not an unaccusative, and it can occur with the applicative suffix ria. Well, it turns out that the applicative suffix ria, the distribution of that suffix, is the only reliable unaccusativity diagnostic in the language, and it's an anti-unaccusativity diagnostic. So the applicative cannot go with typical unaccusative predicates. Yeah. So it can go with transitives, it can go with unergatives, with agentive verbs, but it can't go with an unaccusative. You can't have the cup broke intransitive on Maria. And of course, you can see the punchline already, right? The applicative does go with suppleting verbs, but only with the transitive suppleting verbs. When we already said that it goes with transitives, the applicative is systematically incompatible with all of the intransitive verbs that supplete for number. So we have a sort of a slightly convoluted, but it's the best we've got for this language, a slightly convoluted argument that we're actually right, that the unaccusatives are not separated by a phrasal boundary. The patients are the guys that are exactly close enough to the lexical verb to trigger suppletion, and no one else can. Now, we can go further. We go back to an old paper by Comrie, and we look at Huishol, which is related to Yaqui, but has an interesting difference. And this responds to a question that I know David is thinking, because he asked exactly this question at an earlier talk. Well, how do you know that you don't supervent all of this by having some kind of agreement relation, copying the features of the argument down inside? Well, it turns out we can give a partial answer to that from Huishol. So Yaki has no agreement. The only thing it has is this number-governed suppletion. Weasel has agreement, and it's a cool language. It has agreement with subjects and objects, so you get both of them. And it also has these suppleting verbs. It also has the verbs that supplete for number, and they show the same general distribution. Now here's a cool thing. If I kill, right, if I kill something, these are Comrades examples, they're a little bit violent. So if Juan and Maria are killing me, or I'm killing them, the verb kill, where did it go? Here, alternates between its singular and plural forms, right? This is suppletion for the object of kill. And we see that there's agreement, so here you could really tell a story that says this is inside the morphology, because you've copied the, wherever it went, the object agreement markers into the thing. But in the benefactive, in standard good, so the benefactive is like the implicative, in standard good language mode, right, benefactive language mode, the benefactive adds an argument, and it creates a structure. We saw this in Alison Biggs's talk, Shed a Tree, essentially exactly this. It's been around for a while. The applicative introduces an argument, the benefactee, or the recipient of the goal, that sits between the VP, so the patient and the agent, right? It introduces a higher argument. Agreement works top-down. The verb agrees with the agent, and the object agreement obligatorily picks up the benefactee. The theme loses its ability to agree on the verb. But if we go back, and I kill, for Ad, a bunch of chickens, yeah, right? I can say I killed you the chickens, right? And what verb do I use? I obligatorily use the plural object form of the verb, even though all of the agreement is in singular. Why? Because the agreement, it cares about the top part of the domain, but suppletion can only look at the sister of the verb, and that's the theme. So it's exactly what we predict, and we can replicate these. There's a number of such examples across a variety of languages. In fact, Comrade and others have commented on exactly this aspect of number-governed suppletion to say that it is not a form of agreement precisely because it differs in its distribution from agreement in one and the same language. Okay? So, very important, I think on the handout I call this very important point. Yeah? The locality condition, although you might be tempted to think this is morphology versus syntax, it isn't. It's syntax. It's syntax, and it says there is a locality condition that is syntactically defined. It's just in the case of paraphastic versus affixal alternations, that coincides with morphology versus syntax. But exactly where they differ, it holds its own. So that's new work that defends that. Since words normally don't contain phrases, the syntactic boundary is close to but not the same as a word boundary. Okay, I totally forgot to look at the time, but we'll just go on until somebody throws things at me. Or until I start hearing those wine bottles open and people say it's enough. Yeah. Okay, so I want to consider now, come back to a promissory note I made earlier about the AAB pattern, right? I said the ABA pattern doesn't exist, the AAB pattern also doesn't exist, and if you've been following along, I haven't told you why not. Everything I've told you is still compatible with that existing. Yeah? Okay, so the generalization was good, better, goodest is impossible, we know why. Good, good, or best is also unattested, except for maybe this Georgian example. And so now you probably want to know why. This turns out to be a little bit harder. We start with the containment hypothesis, we start with the same pieces of morphology, and we phrase the question this way: why couldn't you have one that says good goes to bad in the environment of superlative? And that's the only special restricted allemorph, right? That would give you good, good, or best. Yeah? Okay, so we don't get that, so that's got to be impossible. Why is that impossible? Well, we're on a locality kick, so one thing we could do is posit a locality condition that simply says the superlative is too far away from the adjective root, the comparative intervenes, and therefore the superlative can't govern suppletion on the comparative root. And there's different ways, there's a bunch of different current theories of locality. Beata Moskal in her talk gave one version of it. Dave Embeck has worked on this. You can say that any node intervenes, you can say linear order matters, you can say that certain nodes are designated as being cyclic and they intervene and others don't. For today, it really doesn't matter deeply. I'll take the view that says comparative is inherently cyclic, it's semantically active, and therefore it counts as an intervener and the superlative can't. Right? Again, those of us who work on this can fight out amongst ourselves later, or continue those fights about what the real definition is going to turn out to be, but that will work for today. Okay? So that gets it for you, right? You can't have good, good, or best, because the root is inaccessible to the superlative. So that gives you an easy account of it. Of course, I'm going to have to tell you about Latin now, right? Because Latin does seem to give you these ABC patterns, so it does look like it is accessible. I am going to maintain that at the end of the day, this is really what's going on. Okay? So Beata, not this morning, it's a typo, this afternoon, gave us an account of the, or a third of us, I guess, because there were parallel sessions, gave us an account of the apparent asymmetry between pronouns which do supplete for number and case, and nouns which don't supplete for case but do supplete for number, and argued that that was locality. So to the extent that that works, we have a general ballpark here of these kinds of locality things. The morphemes that are too far away to govern suppletion in the root. So that's the general ballpark we're working in, and we'll come back to the cases, and pronouns in just a second. But before we do, as I said, I need to tell you about Latin, because it looks like Latin does have a root. I mean, there's just no way to get around the fact that opt, right, is conditioned by the superlative. Optimus, that's all you've got, that's the form for best. So I've just given you a story of why AAB patterns don't work, but they seem to exclude the ABC patterns as well. Okay, so here I borrow a technical tool. I borrow a technical tool. I borrow an insight that's got various technical manifestations to look at portmanteau morphology. And I'll use the tool of fusion, but it really doesn't matter. This could be insertion at non-terminal nodes. Ad has a theory that does this. Various other people have theories that allow you to do this, right? So the point is, and I'll just use the little letters of mnemonics for nodes. They have no theoretical significance. They just allow me to point from a distance. But actually, since I can walk up to the wall, you don't even need them. So the claim is that you can do vocabulary insertion or a rule of exponents, not just at the terminal nodes, but at this node as well. Right? In canonical distributed morphology, you apply a rule that collapses, a rule of fusion that collapses the two nodes together and gives you this. These are essentially entirely equivalent. And it's hard to find differences between them. So choose your favorite version of this. Point being, you can, under whatever conditions we're going to talk about in just a second, insert a single indivisible element in morpheme, an exponent, at this node C. And of course, this node is local to the superlative. See? Yeah? So we have evidence that we need these kinds of things. So a sort of Ling 101 exercise, if I had covered that up, would say, okay, here's the finished locative cases. Clearly they are split, they are internally complex. You would expect, by analogy to the others, to find set here, right? Because you have an L part for the at on and an S part for the in, but you find these portmanteaus that collapse two things together. Well, Nina Radkevich has given a theory of these and argues that portmanteaus, unlike, say, the spanning theories that the Tromsø people are big on, that given a fixed structure, what you always find is it's a subset of that structure that gets realized by these portmanteaus. So that's consistent with the idea that you can insert, you can have lexical insertion at non-terminal nodes, but you can't have any arbitrary group of nodes realized as a portmanteau. It has to be specific terminal nodes. Eh? Okay, so how does that help us out? Well, if we tweak our rule of Latin to say that opt is not the adjective root in the environment of the comparative and the superlative, but it is in fact a portmanteau expressing the adjective root and the comparative together, right? Then it's inserted here and it's adjacent to the superlative and there's no locality violation. Right? So this is going to be step one. This gives us an immediate prediction. We still don't have all of the why there's no AAB, but we're getting a step closer to Latin. And we make a prediction here that should go way beyond the cases I'm looking at, and that remains to be seen. But the claim is this, in the ABC pattern, if it looks like you have a locality violation, where the adjective is the root is being conditioned by something further out, then you must be invoking a portmanteau that spells out this whole chunk of structure. What does that mean empirically in terms of an empirical prediction? Well, remember we have languages that have all three pieces overt. Czech was such a language, yeah? Well, it turns out that historically at least, right, not synchronically in modern Latin, but in early Latin, the is in the superlative is in fact the comparative. Historically, it's the same guy as the ER in English. Ultimately, this is formative from Indo-European. So you get beatus, beatior, that's the same guy, and then there's some change that makes it is. Yeah? Beatissimus, this is not synchronic Latin, but this is historically the source of this guy. So you get beatissimus with the comparative and the superlative, fidelissimus, potentissimus, and optimus. Why not optissimus? Well, it's consistent with the generalization I just gave you, that the only way for the adjective to be conditioned by the superlative is for it to actually be a portmanteau that spells out this whole chunk together and gives no space for this guy to be spelled out individually. Yeah? So for the 4 cases of ABC patterns, 5 depending on how you count Greek, this is in fact consistent and works. It's just not an overwhelmingly strong argument given that there's a small number of these things. But at least there's no countering from it. The theory of why it looks the way it does, and it looks that way. Okay, so we've got almost everything we need now with a theory of locality and portmanteaus, but we're still one step away, right? Why couldn't we have Latin, now with the portmanteau version of Latin, but get rid of the middle rule and have the optimus form and the bone form, and this would give us bonus, boni, or optimus, and that's an AAB pattern, and they don't exist. So all of that work was for naught, right? Well, if it were, I wouldn't have told you, so there's got to be something I'm going to do with it. So what we need then is a theory that says, in order to have vocabulary insertion at this node, the higher node, you must have an intermediate stage where this guy is sensitive to this guy. Right? So it must be the case that you have suppletion in the lower part of the tree in order to get to the point where you have the suppletive portmanteau. What would give us that? Well, I have it. Luckily, no matter how much time I have left, I'm running out of time on this one, because this gets a little bit hairy in the formal details. But what I'm going to propose here, this is joint work with Susie von Brand, paper that just came out. What we suggest is that fundamentally this is the same intuition as goes into these things like bracket erasure, derived environment condition effects, the PIC if you're a syntactician, things that freeze a small part of the derivation if you don't extend to a larger part of the derivation. So that the derivation proceeds in cycles, and that at certain points in the derivation, you do something and you're stuck with what you've got and you can't change it later. So that's the intuition that I think, is going to give us this effect and exclude the Latin with the intermediate stage. So how exactly does that work? And it's given on your handout. We call this domain fixing. At cycle y, the cycle that's introduced by a node y, you look at x, you look at its sister, its complement. And there's 2 choices you can make. Either you can apply a rule of vocabulary insertion of exponents at that point to x, in which case x is now fixed. You can do things like monkey with its stress and devoice the final consonant, that kind of stuff, but you can't overwrite it. It's been inserted, it's in, it's done, right? It's fixed. Or you wait, you don't do insertion at x. So under what conditions do you not insert at x? And the claim is this: at cycle y, if no rule involves x and y, right, just x and y, then you do vocabulary insertion at x, and x is now inaccessible to further operations, further vocabulary insertion operations. Otherwise, so if there is a rule that involves these 2 guys, a rule of exponents, you hands off. You say, okay, well, I can't fix this guy with certainty at this point, so I wait. Okay? Note that you don't get to look any further. It's a local operation between x and y, and it just says fix or don't fix. Okay, that'll do it. That'll give us the last piece we need. So think of it this way. There's a version of this on the handout as well. Think of a regular adjective big. Right? You build up the structure. We look vocabulary insertion. We look at these rules from the bottom up. We start with just this. We start with adjective and comparative. We say, okay, is there a rule for this adjective that involves x and y? Answer no. So we apply the rule big. big becomes big, it is now fixed, it's no longer big letters, it's now little letters, which is supposed to be theoretically significant. And by the time we add the superlative, we can't do anything to the root anymore. No, we can't. We also can't do something that eats up both of these together. The root is fixed, no monkeying, no tampering with the root, right? Because in a sense, there's no derived environment here. This is the, if you haven't got anything on this cycle is now closed. On the other hand, if you look at, say, good, or the Latin case, right? Again, you start with just the adjective and the comparative, but here there is a rule that applies to both of these guys. So hands off, wait, get up to the next higher level, and now you can put in the opt rule. You can put in the opt. But remember the locality condition. Opt can only be a portmanteau eating up both of these guys. It can't be just the root in the environment of the superlative. So that, a little clunky, admittedly, but that gives us exactly the pieces we need, this sort of very narrow line that we need to walk to make sure that we exclude AAB as a locality violation, but we allow ABC. Well, I'll go back to that. Where'd it go? Anyway, it doesn't matter. So we allow the ABC. So note that what we've got here is a locality condition that says you can't have interactions across this span, but when it translates into actual empirical predictions, there are these fine-grained loopholes. So we can't just say, aha, look, in Latin there's a superlative that changes the root. That's insufficient. We've got to look a little bit more carefully at the narrow details of prediction. Susie and I believe that there are parallels to syntax in terms of this domain extension. Not everybody is convinced, but it would be nice if this locality condition turns out to have parallels elsewhere. Okay. Penultimate little piece, let's go beyond superlatives. So one of the things I have in the book, and this is old hat for a few people, but I like this one. If I'm right about the general proposal, the tools for this are: one, suppletion is a form of contextual allomorphy. Two, these kinds of markedness relations like positive, comparative, superlative are represented hierarchically. Three, there are locality conditions on interactions. Then we should find this stuff all over the place. Right? It shouldn't be a theory of just adjective suppletion. It should be a general theory of suppletion. So in the book, I didn't get very far, but I looked at a few places. One place I looked at was change of state verbs. And it turns out to be a surprisingly robust generalization, but not unproblematic, that you get the same kind of patterning, the lack of ABAs, with verbs derived from comparatives. So you have good, better, and you have to better one's opponent, to better one's chances, but not to good or to gooden, right? We don't have that. Bad, worse, to worsen, not to bad, and come back in a second. And saying gut, besser, verbessern, plahoi, huje, uchut, in Russian. And yes, Alexander pointed out here that a couple of people have pointed out there are some counterexamples, and they're all annoyingly in Slavic. So as I said, this generalization is one that I would like to see worked on further because it's too good to be false, if you see what I mean, right? It's not random, it's not semantic. Paraphrastically, wow. That was an editorial comment of some kind. Good. Don't sit at the back. That says in my talks, you don't sit at the back, you come up to the front. So this is largely true, far more true than just it being accidental, but not entirely absolute. So there's work to be done to look at the corners. As I said, there are a number of apparent counterexamples, many of which fall on inspection. This is one of my favorites, which is why I repeat it. So I've said that you don't get bad, worse to baden, but if you look at English corpora, both informal ones and formal ones, say Google, you find these things like, or is it, as we suspect, part of a new program to baden up the image of the perennial good guy? There's a verb, to baden, right? David Hasselhoff was arrested for public lewdness, and the fan base claimed that this was actually a publicity stunt because he was changing from the role of, the ultimate good guy into a guy who's really mean and bad and streetwise, right? So in this sense, this is how the verb was used, and that's the sense that it occurs in. That's exactly the sense of bad where bad is good. So here's the OED definitions of bad being good, general term of approbation, etc. In exactly that sense, bad has the comparative badder and the superlative baddest. Right? This is the OED. The OED is exceptionally conservative, and they recognize this as well. Right? So the fact here is that, yeah, on the surface it looks like you find this, but what you actually find is bad, worse to worsen, and bad, badder to baden. There's simply two different bads in English. Right? Okay, I'll skip a piece here. Everything I've said at this point is consistent with saying that what this means is a change of state verbs invent a comparative, even when that's not morphologically transparent. I could give it as a nesting structure like this. I could also give it, this would satisfy the conditions as well. This would give you exactly the same effect if you allow yourself to bundle these features together and imagine that there's a single affix, a verbal affix, that has the comparative meaning inside it. All that's needed is that the verbal change, the change of state verbs can properly contain the features of the comparative in the sense that's accessible to conditioning suppletion on the verbs. Right? The difference between these two will make a difference. They'll both predict star ABA, but it'll make a difference in the AAB patterns. The locality relations will be different. And I've argued, and we'll skip that here, that in participles that turns out. Okay, so case. I told you I'd come back to case. This is ongoing work with Beata. Pete's involved in this, a number of other students. We're looking at suppletion in case and pronouns. Okay, so again, you get these markedness hierarchies that you could fan out as long as you want. And if you have three of them, nominative, accusative, dative, you get, say, an Indo-European, ish, mish, mia, right? So the M here is suppletive, and this runs through much of Indo-European, right? You've got the yo and the e form here, and then M is here. What do you get in the next column? Well, you get mia, not iyo or isho, or some version based on a yo, right? So this is an ABB pattern. This is not general of pronouns. The second person singular shows the D throughout. This is totally fine, right? But when you get suppletion in pronouns for case, what you get is these ABB patterns. Icelandic is cognated German, so that's not particularly interesting. Again, here what we have is another kind of hierarchy. If it is structurally represented, as Pablo Taha has argued, we don't need anything near the level of detail that he argues. All we need simply is that the featural representation of the obliques contains the non-subject direct or non-default direct case, so either accusative or ergative, which in turn contains the featural representation of the nominative or the absolutive, which may be no case, right? It doesn't matter. As long as we have at least a three-way distinction that is a containment relation, then we predict that the Indo-European system should generalize. That's a horrible way of saying it, right? It's not that the Indo-European system generalizes, but the observations that we make from the familiar languages generalize to the others. And by and large, that's right. So we've gone through well over 100 languages, in part building on the Surrey Morphology database, and there are, as far as I know at this point, 2 potential counterexamples, both from Archie. Archie just gets in everyone's way, right? But the second person plural, first person singular in Archie have obliques that look like they're built on the nominative stem. Those aside, what we find elsewhere is, well, the Indo-European pattern. Armenian shows a twist in that it's the second person singular as well as the first person singular that shows suppletion, right? So you have do in the second person singular, good, well behaved in the European second person singular pronoun, but then these initial ones in the obliques. But of course, once you start into the pattern, you continue in the pattern, so you get ABBs. Etelman, one I've worked on myself, the second person singular again, you have kuzna, and then you get knu-based forms for all of the obliques. You get into the knu pattern and you stay in the knu pattern. And this one is, I can tell you historically what the source of the phonological changes are, but synchronically that's clearly suppletive. Chakas we saw earlier today, third person singular shows suppletion, and the ... as it indicates there are other cases, and they all are built on the an mixed root, not the ol. Georgian, same thing, this is with demonstrative pronouns. Kafa, this one is also from the Surrey Morphology database. It doesn't require a sophisticated analysis to assume that these are suppletive, that there's no particular phonological rule. Of course, there's a danger here that I don't know what many of the languages we're working with, and so it could be that there's pieces going on. I'll add one other point because it's relevant to a comment, it's relevant to Greb's question to the author, so I'll put it up here now. In Archie, the WH pronouns show an ABB pattern in the stem, but the first person plural exclusive shows what looks like an AAB pattern. So do we find AAB patterns in pronouns? Well, maybe we do, and I'm not confident enough to know at the moment whether we do. But this one is suspicious in that there's no hyphen here, right? This is syncretism. This is neutralization of a contrast. So it's not clear that we should be, for this pronoun, setting up two positions, an A that is zero derived from it, and then a B, rather than saying in this pronoun, the absolute ergative distinction is neutralized, you have real syncretism, in which case this is not a suppletion that is independent from that one. So we need to tease those two pieces apart. Okay, so again, if we have a structural representation of case, then we predict and in fact find the ABA. Unlike the comparatives here, it's a little bit harder to see a semantic basis for this, but one could work with that. Okay, last piece. The last thing I want to get to is where this all comes from. So I told you, however many minutes ago, that this is all going to have a semantic basis. The hypothesis, why should there be these containment relations? The hypothesis is that they're going to be semantics. So what I'm claiming is that the superlative must embed the comparative in all languages, and it cannot just be added to adjectives. Why not? Well, I suggest that there's a semantic complexity condition. I won't give it overly formal. I'll say that some meanings are too complex to squeeze into a single functional morpheme, a single functional form. Yeah? So here is the, taken out of the semantics literature, a standard definition of the superlative. Yeah? And I think that just shows it's self-evident that some meanings are too complex to be in a single functional morpheme. Well, it has actually in it, when you decompose all of these funky symbols, there's two things that are in there. One is the comparative, so 1 degree, the maximum degree that one guy has is higher than the other, and the other is a universal quantifier, than all others. Right? So the claim is going to be that, both of these things are operators in the semantic terms, and you can't put two of these guys in together. Now, I'm not going to give you an a priori theory of what the complexity condition is going to turn out to be. I'll take this as a starting case, and we'll look for others. Yeah? So you can't combine the comparative and a universal quantifier. What else can you not combine? Well, it turns out there's one more generalization that is more robuster than all of the other generalizations I told you about today. This holds systematically across all of the languages I've looked at in all of the samples. There are no counterexamples. Although we find analytic and synthetic alternations in comparison of superiority, there are no affixal comparatives of inferiority. They just don't exist. No language has an affix meaning what the comparative less would mean on the adjective. Why not? Why is this the strongest example, the strongest generalization that we can make? Okay. And I'll tell you just one additional piece. There's a temptation to think of the ER as some kind of corrupt form of an adverb, that some kind of independent word that has shrunk on onto the adjective and become an affix, right, through paths of grammaticalization. And that makes this question somewhat sharper, right? Why can this one shrink and this one not? Why can this grammaticalize and this not? It turns out, actually, that as far as I can tell, and I've really had a lot of this, that's never the source of a comparative affix. The comparative affixes in three families where we have large amounts of data, Indo-European, Finno-Ugric, and Turkic, the comparative affix, the thing that is a comparative affix in one language, in some sister language, is always an attenuative, something like ish, right? So it seems to be generalized from a vagueness function into the comparative function rather than the other way around. Okay, so let's come back to this question of why this should be the case, why there should be no morphological comparison of inferiority. And the simplest answer is to say the complexity condition is at work here too. So let's imagine, as has been proposed by numerous people, that with obvious discussion of various issues, that polar antonyms, that the marked member of a polar antonym, so so short as opposed to tall, is really the combination of tall in some abstract sense with a polarity reversing operator. It's similar to negation, but not obviously not quite the same thing as negation, right? So if your degree of shortness is the same scale as the degree of tallness, just with the polarity reversed. Well, let's say that there's actually a semantic operator there that's doing that. And then short is really suppletion for untall. This is going to be, yeah? So less is more. Really less is more. In the sense that it is an adjective plus a polarity reversing operator plus a comparative. Okay, so how does that get us where we want? Yeah, well, this is the complexity condition at work. Well, if that's the case, oh, and here's an example of a language where you actually use the negation to do this. There are some examples of that sort. So less beautiful is actually negation and the comparative attached together and then attached to the adjective. Okay? And Yaqui does this, but the negation attaches downward to the adjective. This is the same Yaqui, different spelling, but it's the same language as we saw earlier. But the claim is then going to be this. So for a periphrastic expression of a comparison of inferiority, you have to put together the comparative piece and the reversal. Well, that's the adverb less. Right? So you get less short. You get short, you get less short, you can do it. The structure is fine, it's semantically well formed, and you can express it periphrastically. But what if you try to express this as a morphological structure? Well, we know that vocabulary insertion works from the bottom up. The rules are cyclic. We start with the adjective. We have the polarity reversal and the comparative. Well, we already know what the adjective, on the morphological side, what the adjective and the polarity reversal, so for tall, are going to be, right? So we're trying to get, no, we're not trying to get less short. We're trying to get less tall. Yeah? So we have tall and the polarity reverser, and those two guys together are pronounced short. So before we even get to the comparative, we already have a form we can use, namely the form short. And we can add the comparative to that, and we get shorter. So the morphological comparative of inferiority of tall, 4 minutes ago, I told you doesn't exist. It does. It's just pronounced shorter. So these things do exist all over the place. They're just always because of this polarity reversal and because of the complexity condition that blocks you from making a single head be an affix that is the comparative of inferiority. You're forced to use the corresponding polar antonyms. And of course, if you don't have a polar antonym, then you're out of the picture. You're not going to have that thing to worry about. Okay, so the complexity condition generalizes. The containment hypothesis says the comparative by itself is already so complex in meaning that these are the things that it can't combine with, and these give us real results that we see over lots of languages. Okay, so I've been told to stop, so I'll let you read the conclusions. Daniel, I think, had his hand up first.
Yeah, I almost don't want to ask this question.
Then no. Next.
I just worry that the AAB pattern is slightly more robust in the domain of the number.
Mm-hmm.
And at first I thought you were excluding numbers, but then you brought it up explicitly. So if you look at language like Hopi, Kiowa, I think also Kawasaki, for the singular dual plural, you get root suppletion of the form AAB. You get AAB as well, you also get ABC, but you get AAB. And so I thought maybe you would appeal to some difference in phrase structure, but then you did appeal to difference in phrase structure, but it looks like one that should actually then permit you to get the AAB pattern.
But I want to get the AAB pattern for these.
Sorry, AB. Wait a second, you want AAB?
Not for the comparatives. But so, hang on.
How can you get AAB for number?
Well, it depends on the representation of numbers. So let's go to here, yeah? Okay, so here's two structures, both of which, so imagine this alternates with a structure that just has F2, okay? So you have, these are the kinds of structures we've been talking about. The superlative properly contains the comparative, and that will exclude ABA and AAB. Both will be out for the reasons I've given. But if you move to this structure, you still have a containment relation. The representation of root plus f2 is contained in roots plus f1 and plus f2, because I'm trying unsuccessfully to sometimes cover up the point here. Right? That will exclude the ABA for exactly the same reason. Right? The rule that says I change in the context of f2 will also apply even when f1 is there, so there's no going back to the default rule. However, the exclusion of AAB was based on a locality condition, and if features can be bundled in this way under a single head, there's no locality issue. So in this kind of representation, AAB patterns should occur, or shouldn't be excluded.
Okay.
And in the discussion...
I'd be super happy with that precisely because I've been trying to keep things in bundles rather than laying the features out up the spine of the tree. And
Right. So I was going to say, if we take a crazy theory of number that, has the features bundled together, you would get exactly the right result. And so the discussion of the participles, the Germanic participles, or the German participles, is exactly this. That if you bundle the features right, you get AAB patterns and not ABA patterns.
There's one counterexample. Sorry.
From
Yeah.
German, yeah? What?
Linken,
Mm-hmm.
Linkte, gewunken. The participle is different. The preterite and the present forms are, so it's weak in the preterite and present.
Okay.
And strong in the participle. The way. Linken, gewunken, linkte.
Okay. So I was relying on Visa. Thank you for noting that, and I'm lost in pen.
It's wrong.
Yeah, it is, but
Prescriptive grammar precludes gewunken, but it is what everybody uses.
without without changing the simple past as well, corresponding.
No, there is no bank,
Yeah.
which would be the corresponding simple
Right.
past. No,
And-
the German would say ich bank.
Right. And that's the next question. Yeah, right. So there's, this is you'll note, as was just noted, that this presents the three, this is Visa's solution to this, presents the parts of speech not in the textbook order of the parts of speech, but changes.
I withdraw my point actually.
Oh, good.
Because all of them are strong.
Okay.
If we say this only happens in kind of strong forms, none of that is weak with TE. Mine had a regular TE.
So you switches into the other paradigm. Yeah.
So it was basically just, it was
Yeah.
a pattern for regular versus irregular if you wanted.
Right, so one form switches into a different
I
pattern,
apologize.
into a different paradigm. No, but it's still, I still need to take that into consideration. But the point I wanted to make, that Dinah just made, so I switched here from not in the standard order of presentation of the principal parts, but rather one that represents a markedness hierarchy. And that markedness hierarchy goes along, of course, with the distribution of forms in the spoken language, also more broadly in Germanic and Yiddish, that there are varieties that lack a predicate, but have a participle, but no varieties that go the other way around. And that parallels in the comparative and the superlative. There are languages that have a comparative and no superlative, but not the other way around. So, yeah, thank you. I've lost track. I think you were next.
I was wondering if you would want to make predictions about structural limits on sociolinguistic variation that you could have in languages with synthetic comparative superlatives that are moving towards analytical, or the integrated analytical ones. Because you could imagine that you only really have one rate of variation. It's do you pick longer or more long.
Mm-hmm.
And if you can't look ahead to the superlative, then it should be fixed.
Yeah, okay, excellent point.
Or if you would want to stop at saying there could be some kind of sociolinguistic arbitrary meaning, and the only prediction you want to make is that it can never fossilize.
Right. So the prediction I want to make is about the grammar of the. So your first question is, do I want to make predictions about this? Yes, I want to make predictions about everything. But I don't think I do. I don't think I made predictions of that sort. In particular, when I was careful in wherever it was, the one that says that you don't get the longest. That holds about the resources of the language as a whole. Whether it holds about individual forms or not is not so clear for exactly this reason. So for the adjective little in English, my kid is 8, and at a party with linguists, he corrected a native English-speaking linguist the other day and said, you can't say littler, you have to say smaller. There is the OED says that littler only occurs in imitation of childish speech. I say littler. But if you look at the distribution, the corpus of, what's his name, Matthew Adams, I believe, is looking at this in corpus work in somewhere in California, and you find little, and you find littlest, and very few occurrences of littler, partly for sociological reasons, partly probably for phonological reasons. So that looks, right, like either an ABA pattern, if you think the paradigm is little, smaller, littlest, or maybe you use a paraphrastic, more littlest, of this sort. But again, exactly like you say, for sociological reasons creeping in. What I think is going on is that the grammar makes available, the grammar of English makes available two nearly synonymous forms. Small, smaller, smallest, little, littler, littlest. So the grammar has two AAA patterns, but because there are these prescriptive pressures against littler, speakers choose an alternative that's nearly synonymous. And so it looks like you're getting a deviant pattern, but the grammar actually has this form available, it's just suppressed for sociological reasons. So for exactly that reason, I don't want to say that because more little, or because littler is suppressed, that's going to screw up littlest. It's not going to have that enough content. I think you were before David and then David.
Yeah, my name is Sebastian Fenton from the Morphological. Thank you. I want to comment. There might be a potential counterexample to me claiming that verbal number suppletion always extends to S or O's.
Okay.
This is a language that Alex François presented on in Australia last year, an Oceanic language from Vanuatu, whose name unfortunately escapes me now. I think it began with H and I, and then there's a plosive at the end. And this language actually has transitive verbs which allegedly supplete the agent.
Okay. Then, yeah.
So it has a large set of verbs that do suppletion for participants, and that they do exactly what you would expect and what you said. So they supplete for object in terms of if they are transitive, and for subject if they are intransitive. But there are some exceptions. If I remember correctly, take is one of them.
Take?
Take, yes. Quite a transitive verb, one would assume.
Yeah.
I don't know the data in detail. I've never worked on this language, but I thought I'd just mention that.
Yes, thank you. And
Essentially, to look at maybe it turns out that it's not suppletive enough, but there's definitely something going on that might be worth looking at.
yes, that's exactly what we want to look at. So thank you. Could I ask you to email me that reference? I mean, obviously not with the language name because you don't know what it is, but the author's name and the context. I would say on it, you're right. Interestingly, these number marking affixes in some languages follow different pattern differently. So Austronesian languages have this, some of them. The number marking where it patterns differently from the regular agreement in the languages. Nuean is an example of this, right? So there's a number affix that typically marks S arguments and O arguments, exactly as expected. And there are two transitive verbs in Nuean that allow number marking of the transitive subject. And both of these are applicatives of posture verbs. So to sit the table, meaning to sit on the table. To sit, intransitive suppletes, and to sit the table is transitive but still suppletes. If your verbs had been like that, I would have been more relieved than if they take, which seems like I want to look into the lexicography for the word.
Yeah. Two questions, one small related to that and one other one. So the small one related to that is really just where the features on the DP object such that they're not blocked by the spatial boundary of the DP and the verb.
They got to be right on top.
I know, but that's kind of, okay, that's interesting if that's the solution, right? Because under the agreed system, actually, you don't need to do that. Right? So that sort of feels that there's a weird redundancy being coming out. So that was the first one. The second one was, you mentioned briefly that if you wanted to, you could rewrite actually some phonological, not capital letters, but like some kind of phonological representation of good as bon. I guess it would be bon as bon, right? And then something, and then. So my question was, if you do that for Latin, and you say that actually what you've got is the phonological representation now being the input to the superlative thing, right? Then that kind of does the domain extension stuff you wanted to do with your 2013 paper. But it doesn't be a phonological faithfulness within the root instead.
Yeah.
And that feels to me like, wow, depends. I mean, that's again an interesting kind of question about where you want the theory to go, right? Because that feels quite elegant to do that, right?
Yeah, so that's a nice point. We hadn't explored that. So for here, where'd it go? Right? So for here, the trick is to make sure that this rule exists in order to be able to have that rule. Right? And we do that by monkeying with the locality definitions. But your suggestion is to say you can only rewrite a node if you have a rule that spells out that node independently. That's nice. That would get this as well.
And there is some general question, I think, that, I don't know, I've been getting uneasy over the last few years about the abstractness of our roots. Because there is a deep question about why roots are generally pretty phonologically faithful. Which actually just seem, you know, which we have no explanation for. We don't put some phonology in that root. So I don't know. It just feels to me that that would be a more elegant way of capturing it.
Yeah, you're right. Narrowly, it is. We were driven by exploring these parallels to various syntactic things. But if they don't pan out, that does sound nice as well. So what I haven't thought through. There were a bunch of things to think about. One that I put aside was exactly this question of the representation of the roots. And I give this caveat, I'm not committed to saying that all caps is significant, as opposed to being real phonological material. And you're right, I hadn't thought about this. This is a consequence of it. This is a place where that has a consequence.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one short question.
Okay, one tall person.
You heard it was short. One short question.
Okay. One word. So, talking about containment and the division of labor between morphology and syntax, you had this example from Persian in 18, right? So, there is just one observation that I would like to know how you want to build it into the system, or if it should be built into the system. Actually, adjectives and comparative forms are always post-nominal in Persian. But the superlative form, as an exception, is always pre-nominal. So I was, while we were talking, thinking about whether one could, it comes into play into the system that you're presenting.
So let me throw that back to you. Do you have a sense of where it might matter? So what I haven't done is here, actually. Where'd it go? So where is syntax? Syntax, hello. You could find a syntactic tree faster than I can. There we go. This is clearly an oversimplification. If you look at anybody's syntax of superlatives, so for example, in Russian, or Matashansky has written on this, others have written on this, the superlative is a long form adjective other than four exceptions. The comparative is never, the comparative is never other than four exceptions. There's more to the syntax and semantics of superlative than simply saying, well, I just plunk some guy on top of the comparative. And you're right, there are languages where the external syntax as well as the internal syntax is different. And I've just put all of that aside. So if you have if you can help me by saying, here's a particular place where your assumptions are going to either run into trouble or force you to say this elsewhere, then I want to sit down and work through that. No, I want to have someone else, not a breakthrough road. But you're right. You're asking me to be explicit about my commitments to syntax well beyond this, and I haven't done that. Read the scene.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I have to give some pieces of this back to various people. Right?